Hi everybody, welcome to Module 1 where we're going to talk over some of the basics of course design. In this video, we'll discuss student-centered teaching and backwards design. First, we'll talk about our goals and objectives. At the end of this module, you'll be able to define concepts like backward course design, instructor-centered versus student-centered teaching, learning objectives, Bloom's taxonomy, and alignment. You'll be able to articulate learning objectives for your classes, and you'll begin considering instructional, and assessment strategies that align with your learning objectives. One more thing before we get started that I'll note is that I'm not appearing on screen. This is Ellen, by the way. And the reason for that is this particular presentation has a lot of text and charts in it. And one of the things we know is that often video can be distracting. Video of a speaker can be distracting when there's a lot of stuff going on the screen. So we wanted to show you an option of recording a video that doesn't necessarily focus on showing the speaker's face. So let's get started. First, we're going to address backward course design. What does this mean? Basically, it's an argument put forward in a book called Understanding by Design that our lessons, units, and courses should be logically inferred from the results sought, not derived from the methods, books, and activities with which we're comfortable. Curriculum should lay out the most effective way of achieving specific results. In short, the best course design derives backward from the learning sought, and this is why we refer to it as backward course design. And it's a central aspect of what we refer to as student-centered learning or teaching. And student-centered design is opposed to instructor-centered design, which I think is probably a format that we're all pretty familiar with. So with standard course planning, what you do is you choose the textbook, and then you write the syllabus, and then you write or revise your lectures and your notes, and you make your presentations, and then you write the homework and exam questions based on that. So it's very much focused on what the instructor what does the instructor want to teach? What do I know? And what do I want to tell my students? As opposed to backward design, which involves formulating broad learning goals that turn into specific learning objectives. What do we want students to get out of the course? Thinking about the student perspective rather than starting with the instructor perspective. Then we design assignments. And what we might call assessments, to figure out whether students are reaching towards or reaching those goals, those specific objectives. And then we prepare other learning activities, instruction, or course content that will help students achieve these objectives by completing these assignments. So it's very much a student-centered, student-focused perspective, not starting with what do I want to teach in this class, but instead starting with what should students learn? What should students leave this class with? So we start with learning objectives. What are the most important things that students will learn in your course? It's important that we set learning objectives that are student-centered, right? That are not necessarily focused on what I do as an instructor, but are focused on what students will do as in their role as students. So what kind of skills and knowledge do I want students to develop and demonstrate in my course? It's also important that these learning objectives be clear and specific. How can we articulate those objectives in a way that clearly indicates to students what they're going to achieve in the course? And finally, we need to set learning objectives that are measurable or accessible in some way. We need to be able to have assessments that can judge whether or not students have met these objectives. And therefore, we need to have these objectives be something that's very focused and specific, and something that can be measured. That doesn't mean, of course, that you can't have broader goals for your students in your course that are not necessarily measured or not necessarily assessed. And one of the things that I really like to do here is have students set broad goals for themselves, or leave a line in the objectives part of the syllabus for a goal that students want to set themselves, right? Something that's not necessarily measured. But when we're talking about the learning objectives that are going to determine what our assessments and what our the structure of the class is, it needs to be something that is measured or measurable. So when we're thinking about these learning objectives, the skills and knowledge we want students to develop and how we can articulate those objectives in a clear way, one of the tools that we can use to help us is referred to as Bloom's taxonomy. So developed by a guy named Bloom, but has been revised many times, and it has been visualized in a lot of different ways. But basically, the idea is this, that we have different categories of learning, different categories of cognitive tasks, that we can kind of divide up and think about in different ways and assess in different ways. So we might have, we can see at the bottom here, memory tasks where we expect students to recall facts and basic concepts. We can have understanding tasks where we expect students to be able to explain ideas or concepts. Application tasks where we expect students to use information in new situations. We can expect students to analyze information where they draw connections amongst different ideas, to evaluate information, to justify a stand or a decision, and finally to create, to produce new or original work. Now, some people have critiqued this triangle visualization, which implies that memory tasks are kind of the most basic and creation tasks are the most complex. But it also implies that creation tasks should be the least frequent. For example, they're up at the top and occupy the smallest portion of the triangle. So there's been a number of revisualizations of Bloom's taxonomy, and you can kind of use the one that feels the most useful to you. So this is a different visualization that puts creation, evaluation, and analyzation up at the top, alongside each other, with applying, understanding, and remembering down at the bottom, in kind of an inverted triangle. And you can kind of think through ways in which this might help you reprioritize what you want your students to do as they kind of work their way up this triangle. Maybe you would have students in lower level courses particularly focus on remembering and understanding, whereas an intermediate course, maybe they're focused on applying, and advanced courses, they're focused on either creating, evaluating, or analyzing. So we can kind of think about these working in various ways. One of the most useful things for us, though, when we kind of think about how to outline our own learning objectives is looking at these action verbs that are associated with Bloom's taxonomy and the different categories within Bloom's taxonomy. So verbs like choose, define, label, all in the remembering category, classifying, comparing, or contrasting in the understanding category, applying, building, or developing, experimenting in the applying category, and so on, to kind of think about the different tasks that we ask students to do when we're trying to develop assessments to figure out whether our students have learned how to do these things that we've successfully taught them or not. And this, by the way, this PDF is shared in the resources, so you can just take a look at this, especially if you can't quite see all the text. I know it's pretty small. So this task this question of the words we use, leads us to the question of alignment. So alignment is thinking about how students' learning experiences will help them achieve these learning objectives. So how will their learning experiences in the course, that is assessments or instruction, lectures, readings, course content, everything, kind of help them get to the point where they achieve these learning objectives by the end of the course. And so what we need to do here is align our learning experiences with our learning objectives, considering assessments and all sorts of instructional activities and our course content. So what learning experiences, that is readings, lectures, activities, assignments, would best help students achieve these objectives? So particularly thinking about assessments, how do we judge whether students have achieved these objectives? We can use Bloom's taxonomy, again, use these categories to align assessments with learning objectives. Some assessments are going to work better for particular types of tasks than others. So if we want students to focus on this remembering category with these verbs of recall or recognize or identify, using tests where we expect, fill in the blank, matching, labeling questions, where we expect students to recall or recognize terms, facts, and concepts, as opposed to, let's say, analyzing. Can students distinguish between different parts? Can they analyze, differentiate, organize, or attribute? Might be more appropriate to doing a paper or a project or a debate that requires students to discriminate or select relevant and irrelevant parts of an argument, to determine how different elements of information function together, to think about bias, values, underlying intent in presented material, things like that. So these are different cognitive tasks, and different assessments are appropriate if we want to think about whether students have achieved these objectives. So we'll be talking more about assessments in Module 5, I believe. But before we get there, you can start thinking about these objectives and how we think about them by using an alignment matrix like this. And I know the word matrix might make people start thinking about learning outcome matrices that we have, that we're required to submit. But I promise this can actually be a productive task and not just frustrating busy work. So how do we do this? We think about the learning objectives, specific knowledge and skills that we want our students to develop in the course. And we can think about assessments. What kinds of tasks will reveal whether students have achieved that learning objective? And then finally, instructional activities. What kind of teaching methods or strategies can we use to help students practice and achieve the learning objective? How can we help them prepare for these assessments? So I've included a couple of my own learning objectives for some of my literature classes. So I want students to be able to closely read and analyze ancient and modern literary texts. So what kind of assessments can I have them do that will show me that they can closely read and analyze texts? Well, one of the things I like to do is have them do journal assignments in which they choose a brief passage to analyze each week. There's something they're practicing consistently. And then second, another idea would be to have students generate discussion questions where they kind of closely read the text and then help other students kind of closely read the text by generating questions from the text. These assessments don't necessarily have to be high stakes. They can be low stakes assessments that aren't stringently graded, but can still assess from the instructor's perspective whether or not we think that the students know how to closely read and analyze text. And then finally, the instructional activities that we can kind of consider to help students practice this before they're being assessed and learn these skills so they see somebody modeling closely reading and analyzing a text. To help students practice and to help students achieve these goals, what can we do? First of all, in my class, I like to make sure I'm assigning appropriate reading, so things especially that aren't too long, so that I can allow students to read for detail when I want them to closely read and analyze texts. And something else that I can do is lead in-class discussion about the readings and model these close reading strategies for them. I particularly like to display the text on the screen so they can see what I'm doing when I'm reading and kind of pointing out various aspects of the text. So that's kind of one learning objective and the different ways I can assess it or teach it. And that's just one of my learning objectives for the course. I also have others like wanting students to be able to build clear, concise, and convincing arguments or using primary sources. So I would want to assess that in a different way. And maybe I want to assess that using something that is more stringently graded, like an essay exam or a paper. So we can have a variety of different types of assessments, both graded and ungraded, high stakes and low stakes, that allow instructors to see whether students are progressing towards these learning objectives. And so we can design our instructional activities that are made to best set up our students for success. So you can continue thinking about this in the reflection questions that we've set for this week, in which you can pick one or more of your current or potential courses and think about some of these questions about how you would want to set learning goals, broader learning goals, or more specific learning objectives. How can you articulate these objectives in a way that clearly indicates to students what they'll achieve? And then what kinds of tasks, instructional activities, or assessments can you use to kind of help students build towards achieving these learning objectives. Feel free to spend some time writing your responses in a reflection journal, or respond in the appropriate form on Discord. And that's it for Module 1. See you later.